money campaigning for them, in a way happens in the US. Super PACs, which are organisations which will either support the Democrats or support the Republicans, and that's a means of avoiding the spending controls that apply to political parties. So we don't want that to happen here. And the third part of that bill is something we're asking the trade unions to do, which is just to keep better control of their membership records, so that we know that if a trade union is going to launch a strike ballot, that they are actually balloting people who are currently a member of the union, as opposed to someone who has lapsed perhaps some months ago. So that's a relatively small change. So I'm involved with that, and what I hadn't anticipated is the way in which organisations can look at what a government intends doing and then see it through a prism which is completely different from the one that we see it through. In other words, lots of the charities now are worried that we are trying to stop them talking about policy issues in the run-up to a general election campaign. That is absolutely not what we're trying to do. We have no intention of doing that. The bill doesn't do that, but for some reason, probably because one organisation called 38 Degrees have put on the front of their website a statement that says the government are going to gag all charities. They have thought, some of them, that is true, and they're responding to that. So we're having to make it absolutely clear, and we're going to change the law slightly, or the bill slightly, to make it absolutely clear that that was never our intention, and it is not our intention to do that. So that's my role as a minister. Obviously, the role I've got as a Member of Parliament is coming out to meet pupils at schools, students at schools. It's meeting businesses. I'm running an independent business competition at the moment to try and promote independent traders, independent businesses. And I've got regular contact with the local hospital, for instance, where probably for the last 15 years, the St Helier Hospital campaign has been the biggest campaign that I've had to run, because the last 15 years it has always been under one threat or another, and currently the threat is to the A&E, the maternity and the children's ward, as part of a reorganisation of hospitals across south-west London. So if some of you I know live in Croydon, then potentially you're affected by the same review, because Mayday Hospital or Croydon University Hospital is affected by the same review. Those of you who live in Epsom Hospital is affected, and if any of you live either around Kingston Hospital or St George's, then equally those hospitals are part of this review. So as a Member of Parliament, I also represent my constituents' interests, so we'll take up issues like that, big issues in the constituency, or alternatively very small individual problems. And the individual problems that people will raise with their Member of Parliament will go from, I can't get a place at the local school for my child, to I'm overcrowded, I'm living in a two-bedroom flat with 6 people in the flat, what can you do about it? Through to the more obscure requests that I've had, and I think the most obscure request I've ever had was from someone who rang me a few years ago and said, there's a spaceship that's going to arrive, can you talk to your party leader to make sure the spaceship has landing rights when it arrives? And I always deal with things in a very straight-faced way and said, yes, I will talk to my party leader, and I'm sure that he'll want to raise that with the appropriate bodies at the appropriate time. So that's the range of things that I can get asked about. And finally, I suppose I'm a Liberal Democrat, so I want as many people to vote Liberal Democrat as possible, and therefore I have to advocate on behalf of the party to ensure that not only in Carshot and Wallington, where I'm pleased to say that in the last 4 elections people have re-elected me, but more wider than just Carshot and Wallington, people are aware of the Liberal Democrats and are willing to support us. So I think probably that's enough from me. I'm very happy to take as many questions as possible, and I think we can run it certainly until 10 to 2 or slightly beyond if there's enough demand for it.
Why is it in our interest to vote Liberal Democrat?
Okay. Why is it in your interest to vote Liberal Democrat? First of all, one of the reasons that people haven't voted Liberal Democrat in the past is because for 60 years we haven't had any experience of government, and I can see why that is something that would put people off in terms of voting for a party. This election will be different in that you can look at our track record in government. Now, there may be some aspects of it that you're not happy with. On the other hand, I think hopefully there'll be some aspects that you do think are notable. So just to give you some examples of that, in terms of what we said were our top priorities, on the front page of our manifesto in the general election campaign, we said, for instance, that we would reduce the amount of income tax people had to pay. So we put up the tax threshold, which affects in a positive way something like 25 million people on low middle income. That was number one priority on our manifesto. We also talked about introducing the pupil premium. So that is £2.5 billion extra that is going in to support students who are struggling the most. May not be particularly relevant to your school, but is to many other schools. We talked about focusing on jobs, and in coalition we have delivered 1 million plus extra jobs in the private sector. Now, whilst there have been jobs lost in the public sector, for every job lost in the public sector, there have been 3 created in the private sector. I think some very specific things about the Liberal Democrats, which I hope you would support us for. The reason I joined the Liberal Democrats is because as a party, the Liberal Party, as it was when I joined, had the strongest approach towards issues to do with the environment. And I think climate change remains the biggest issue that we face globally, although there will be some climate change deniers who would like to say it's not happening, but I think the overwhelming evidence that it is happening in our lifetime, and to a great extent we are responsible for it. And if my generation doesn't do something about it, then I'm afraid the costs simply get passed on to you for your generation to sort out in your working lives. And as a party, we've got the strongest environmental policies. We've delivered those in government. So things like creating the first green investment bank in the world. So that's the first bank that will invest specifically in environmental projects. Things like the Green Deal that Ed Davey has been championing. There are a number of things that, as a party, we've been able to deliver in government that relate to the environment. So hopefully there are some reasons why you should vote Liberal Democrat. Maybe now I'm about to get some questions about why you shouldn't, but we'll come on to those.
Yes, any questions, please raise your hands. Let's go to the gentleman over the back here.
You talked about the front page of your manifesto. You also mentioned the uni fees, which obviously is somewhat flexible, which you failed to deliver on as a party.
Yep.
And you yourself went to Wellington Goals, I believe, and you said that you personally, regardless of your party line, would vote that they would remain the same, but yet in that parliament you could vote for them to be raised to 9,000. And also you say that you're concerned about the environment, but you're absent from the vote on the South London incinerator in Benton.
Right.
So I slightly
Okay. Well, first of all, the vote about the South London incinerator, as a member of Parliament, I don't actually have a vote in that vote. So it would have been useful perhaps for me to attend and listen to the meeting, but in practice I can't vote in what is a decision by local councillors, not members of Parliament. And I've had extensive contacts with people on the incinerator issue, and I'm quite happy to explain why I think in practice the incinerator is, or the energy recovery facility, is the best option that's available to deal with our waste. The fact is that year on year, the amount that your parents will pay in council tax is going up, and going up quite substantially as a result of the increased charges that are levied when you take waste and stick it in a hole in the ground, because the EU are trying to stop us doing that. So the savings that will be derived from that plant are very significant, as well as the fact that it creates a lot of heat, which can actually be used as renewable energy. And I'm quite hopeful that what will happen on the back of that when that project goes ahead, as well as being able to create the biggest country park in London that's been created in recent years on that site, that actually the heat that comes from that plant will be able to power a lot of homes, potentially St Helier Hospital as well, for instance, but also will be able to provide cheap power to industries that operate along Beddington Lane. So I think that is the best solution that's available. In relation to tuition fees, I thought I'd bring the pledge, because obviously tuition fees is something that gets raised regularly. And I just wanted to, because what people tend to forget is that the pledge was in 2 parts. Do you know what the second part of it was? Sorry? Right, okay, well the second part of it was to pressure the government to introduce a fairer alternative. And this is what the Institute for Fiscal Studies, a respected international body, says about the new system. They say the government's decision to raise tuition fees will create a system that is substantially more progressive than the previous system, that is because the 30% of graduates with the lowest lifetime earnings will be better off under the new arrangements. So I accept that we didn't deliver on the first part. Nick and I, on a number of occasions, have publicly apologised for not honouring our pledge in relation to the first half, but actually in relation to the second half of the pledge, which was making sure that the system of tuition fees was more progressive than the previous system, we have delivered. So in my view, that's a 5 out of 10, which is not brilliant, but it's better than the 0 out of 10, which I think people are giving us for failing on the first half of the pledge, but actually delivering on the second half.
Thank you. Yes.
If the next general election is not in Parliament, would you want to be in coalition with Labour?
You're not going to get a politician, I suspect, from any of the parties answering that question. And we will all answer it in the same way, which is we are going to fight to get as many Liberal Democrat MPs elected as possible. Then it will be the party that has the biggest mandate in Parliament, which is mandate's a bit tricky in that it's both number of seats but also number of votes, and they don't necessarily sort of tie in exactly, so there could be a little bit of a grey area there, but assuming the party that gets the biggest number of seats also gets the biggest number of votes, then that party will have a mandate to form a government. If they then want to talk to us, then we'll talk to them. And I think what will happen is that, partly as a result of the tuition fees question, what is going to happen in the run-up to the next general election is first you will get no party politician signing any pledge of any meaningful nature. We may well sign things that say we believe in motherhood and apple pie, but in practice it's going to get very difficult to get anyone to sign any sort of pledge, because the likely outcome of the next general election is actually going to be no overall control with a hung parliament. And therefore no party is in a position to be able to say everything we put in our manifesto we will deliver, because if it's a hung parliament they're going to have to negotiate their manifesto commitments with another party or parties. So I think what the parties will have to do is that, and you've already, if you listen to what some of the politicians are saying, what David Cameron, I think, was interviewed about it a couple of days ago, this issue of a red line. I think it was Theresa May, she was interviewed about it. She was asked, is it a red line for you that the UK, if you enter into negotiation with another party in a hung parliament scenario, is it a red line for you that the UK will have to come out of the European Convention on Human Rights? She didn't answer that question. And she didn't answer that question, I presume, because it's not a red line for them. And if they do end up in a discussion with another party after the next general election, that won't be the thing that they'll be saying, if you don't deliver that for us, forget it, we're not willing to do a coalition, agree a coalition with you.
Is it possible at this point to say that it's more likely to be, if there is a coalition, which party would be in that situation?
Well, I think the polls at the moment suggest Labour are in the lead, but the polls sort of 18 months out of the general election are often not what happens. Things can change very substantially in the last 4 weeks of a campaign because there's additional pressure, and perhaps what we're beginning to see in relation to what I think is a completely outrageous and disgusting story that the Daily Mail are running about whether Ed Miliband's dad, hates the UK, that may be a flavour of the sort of campaign that we may get, and therefore that does have the potential to change very significantly levels of support in the last sort of in the run-up to the general election. The balance between trying to maintain the standards in schools and at the same time satisfying the needs of parents. And I mentioned earlier that one of the things that people come and see me most frequently about at certain times of the year is that my child hasn't managed to get into the secondary school of my choice. So that is a really big issue. I don't think there's any easy solution to it. There is a lot of pressure on school places. We've got a bulge of pupils going through the primary schools at the moment, who I think will hit the secondary schools by about 2015, and by then we have to have provided extra capacity. We know that if the borough were to make more places available in the selective schools, then unfortunately that's no guarantee that the extra children who are now living in Sutton are actually going to get a school place because of course the catchment areas for those selective schools goes much beyond the borough boundaries. So the local authority's got that difficult balancing act to make between trying to provide more school places in the comprehensive schools, which they know will be, broadly speaking, available to local children, and at the same time allowing some of the selective schools to expand because there's demand for it, and also we know that a proportion, 30% or thereabouts, of the pupils in those schools will actually be from the borough.
So the school should represent the community.
I would like the schools to be as representative as possible of the borough, because I know that for instance, one of the problems that schools have, the wider the catchment area is simply for things like school sports at the weekend. Whereas the distances that pupils are travelling are starting to get larger and larger and larger. In practice, it becomes more and more difficult to have school sports activities at a weekend, because then the travel distances that are involved are challenging for the parents or the pupils if they're trying to make it under their own steam.
If you were speaking strictly off the record, would you, in the next
With
election,
Twitter, you can never speak strictly off the record, but
yeah, in the next general election, disregarding the fact that Nick Clegg will be would you prefer to have Vince Cable or Nick Clegg as a leader?
no, I fully hope that Nick will be the leader in the run-up to the next general election. I think that he took the right decision to take us into coalition. It was a tough decision. It's been tough in the polls. It's clearly been tough in relation to issues like tuition fees for the party. But at the same time, it's given us, I think, credibility from an economic point of view that we've never had before. And we've had people in key positions like Vince at Biz, in the business department, delivering a very substantial part of the government's growth agenda. And Ed Davey, for instance, delivering a very, very substantial part of that in the energy department. So I think he made the right decision, and I'm fully behind him. Obviously, Vince is a key player of the team, and he will be a very, very prominent player in the general election campaign when that gets underway.
Do you think he'd make a good or better leader than Vince?
Pass.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the cross-country guys will have to leave in about 5 minutes, so if their questions could be asked now,
Anyone from
it'll probably be the
cross-country?
last question. So, while we teach them.
To the person over there.
When did you start to decide that you wanted to represent your constituency in politics, and from there, where did that lead you until
Okay. Well, first of all, I would recommend that all of you consider becoming a Member of Parliament, of whichever party. I think overwhelmingly the people that I meet, members of Parliament from all the parties, actually we're not in the business of being politicians to line our pockets, contrary to the impression that's been given with the expenses story of 3 or 4 years ago. Actually, overwhelmingly politicians are in it because they think that they've got some views and ideas about how to improve people's lives. Clearly we do it with varying degrees of success. So firstly, I would recommend it. Secondly, why did I get involved? I got involved in the early 1980s. Now, none of you were around in the early 1980s. I'm the only one who was, possibly. The early 1980s was a very political time in a way that we haven't really seen again. Very, very polarised. Left, Michael Foot wanted to nationalise everything. On the right, Margaret Thatcher wanted to privatise everything. And it was a period where you'd be walking around London and you would see miners or supporters of the miners on street corners with a bucket collecting money for the miners' strike. It's something we've not really experienced at all. I don't think you've experienced in your generation yet. I mean, you might do. But it was a very, very ideological time, and I didn't like that, because I think actually what politicians should do is look at problems and identify the right solution, as opposed to looking at a problem and thinking of an ideological solution to a problem. And the Liberal Party at that time was much more pragmatic, so I got and wanted to look at things on a case-by-case basis. I got involved with them. I feel strongly that our country's future is as part of the European Union. Not necessarily a very popular thing to say, but are those of you who might be considering of flirting with UKIP when you've got the chance to vote at 18, just think about what you expect to do in your future careers. I'd be surprised if a lot of you don't at some point expect to work perhaps in another European Union country. France, Germany, Italy, some of the new countries, Poland, who knows? You might see that as part of your normal career development, and I hope that you would. Some of you looking much longer, further down the line, I'm sure you won't be thinking about retirement, but clearly there are lots of British people who do think about retirement, and they go and retire in Spain. Well, if we weren't part of the European Union, you would not be able to go and work in another European Union country with the ease that you could do when you start your careers, and your parents or your grandparents could not choose, as they can do now, to go and retire in Spain. They couldn't do that in America, they couldn't do that in Australia, they couldn't do that in New Zealand, and the reason they can do that is in European countries is because we're part of the European Union. So I think our future is in the European Union. Yes, there's scope for reforming it, but I think fundamentally they are our biggest trading partner, they're the people we have the connections with. That is a relationship that we should develop rather than trying to pull out of it. So that's a reason why I got involved with the Liberal Party, because it is strong in terms of its commitment to improving and reforming Europe, but not coming out of it.
Guys, if we just pause for about 2 minutes, or we'll actually take 5 plus countries.
I can see the effect mentioning the European Union has. It's depressing.
University education system more progressive in the UK, so we're going to give money and grants to users that haven't got a lot of money and they're the poorest people in society. And then the people that are the wealthiest in society can already afford to go to university. So what are you doing for the rises in fees that have affected all of the middle classes?
Okay. Well, for those of you who didn't hear the question was, we've introduced progressive policies which do benefit 30% of students on the lowest incomes. The richest student, or the students in the richest families, their parents can afford to pay. What are we doing for people in the middle? I suppose the difficulty that we've got is that in 2008, as a country, we suffered the biggest economic shock that we have faced since the Second World War, left us as the country with the largest deficit in the industrialised world, and in those circumstances our ability to help the middle classes, as you've said, is very restricted. So that's why we focused on ensuring that the poorest students are able to benefit more, because one of the biggest problems that we have as a country is that between what's happened since the 1950s is that actually social mobility in the UK has gone down. In other words, people's ability to progress from what would be described as the sort of E, Ds and Cs from a sort of social categorisation point of view, their ability to upskill and to get a better job than their parents has gone backwards, and that's why we felt that we needed to focus it on the poorest students. Now, maybe, you know, if the economy grows and there's more tax revenues coming in, that there may be a possibility of supporting people in the future, but it's not possible to do that at the moment. And I suppose the last thing I would say is that the evidence still is very strong that people who've been to university do get a substantial financial benefit over the duration of their working life, to the tune of £100,000 to £150,000, and therefore it may be worth investing in that. And as you'll know, you don't pay anything after you've graduated until you hit £21,000. It's graduated, so you start paying a little bit at £21,000, and the more you earn, the more you pay. And therefore, we think that in the difficult financial circumstances we were in, that was the most that we could do.
I'm interested to know what the Lib Dem policy is on immigration.
Yeah.
Do you think it would change in order to counter the charge of UKIP? What is it?
Okay, what's the Lib Dem policy on immigration? Well, I mean, we're in coalition government and we work with the Conservatives, and I think you can see the position we've adopted in relation to policies that the government have introduced. So, for instance, we have tackled the issue of bogus colleges, very significant problem where students were coming to the UK from non-EU countries to study in colleges where in practice what it was being used for was a means of getting people into work as opposed to getting them to study. So we've closed those colleges. We've cut down on the number of people coming from non-EU countries to the UK. Clearly, because we are members of the European Union, there is nothing that we can do about reducing the numbers of people coming to the UK from other EU countries. To be able to do that, we would have to do what UKIP want to do, which is leave the European Union. That's the only way that you can stop free movement of EU citizens across our borders. And for the reasons that I set out earlier, the benefit which I think we derive, the fact that there are 3.5 million jobs in the UK that are dependent on EU trade, the opportunities it gives you when you start work to go and work abroad. I think and just one final thing I would say, if you talk to the Japanese car manufacturers about the reasons why they have invested in plants here and why now the UK, for the first time since the 1970s, actually makes and exports more cars than we import, the reason they place their businesses here is because we are members of the European Union and they know they can build cars here and export them to other parts of the European Union without tariff barriers or any trade barriers being imposed on them. So I think we've done things to address immigration. One thing that the Liberal Democrats in particular we have campaigned for, both in opposition and more recently in government, and we are finally delivering it, is reinstating border controls at the exits. At the moment, if you come into the UK, obviously you are checked in. However, if you leave the UK, there is no process of confirming you've left the country, which has the very negative effect of you not knowing if someone's come in on, say, on a visa, student visa, whether they have subsequently not returned home at the point that they were supposed to, and in fact have disappeared into the black market to work illegally. So by reintroducing exit checks, we will have a much better idea, Lib Dem policy, of what's happening in terms of where people are coming from and whether they're returning back to their countries of origin if they've come here to study or to work or on a vacation.
As you said, the Lib Dems primarily focused on preventing global warming. Do you think the future is more important than the present?
Do I think the future is more important than the present? No, I think we have to try and run those two things in parallel, and that's why there are things that we can do now in terms of encouraging a shift towards greener behaviour that is already happening. So, you know, the fact that the tax disc for people's cars, the price of it goes from the one that we've got, because it's low emissions, I think is only £35 a year. The more sort of petrol your car consumes, then the higher the price of your road tax. That's about sending messages to people about getting them to make environmental choices which actually, far from costing them something, actually benefit them, because they're paying less for their road tax, they're paying less on petrol. So there are things that we can do now and should be doing, but I think the long-term goal has got to be to reduce very significantly our emissions. Otherwise, the predictions that are being made about the rise in temperature, the impact that will have on a number of states which will simply disappear as a result of rising sea levels, or the effect that it will have on sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, in terms of desertification and the pressure that potentially that will put on us and other European nations as more people seek to leave those countries because of the impact of climate change, means that we've got to try and deal with it now, but we've got to have a long-term goal of reducing our emissions very, very substantially. And Sutton, the local borough, is very much part of that process and is committed to this concept of what's called one planet living. At the moment, the rate that we are consuming things, we would need about 3 planets, the equivalent of 3 planets in terms of the natural resources. for the rate we're consuming things. We need to try and get it down to one planet living, and I don't know whether any of you have been to see BedZ as part of any geography projects, or if you come in by train, you'll see it as you go past Hackbridge Station. They have just about got down to one planet living, certainly in terms of their use of energy for heating. The one thing that they haven't yet really managed to address is that a lot of things that they buy, there's sort of built-in environmental impact into that they can't really control to any extent. But that's what we've got to try and move towards.
Obviously, there's fairly mixed opinions about nuclear energy sources amongst green activist groups and things. What's the Democrat view?
Yeah. That's a very good question, and I suppose my position has moved from being hardline against any nuclear power to a position now where if climate change is one of the global issues we've got to face, perhaps we do need to be looking at the role that nuclear can play, because nuclear, there's no doubt that from a climate change point of view, the CO2 emissions from a nuclear plant are far, far smaller than they are from a comparable coal or gas-fired power station. So I think the balance has shifted, I think. So that's why at our party conference, the party voted not for nuclear power, but to allow discussions to take place about whether if you can address some of the real significant costs associated with nuclear power, because we haven't, as a country, and I'm not sure any country has addressed this yet, we haven't dealt with the decommissioning costs associated with nuclear power, because you decommission a nuclear power plant, you end up with a great heap of radioactive waste, which you then got to park somewhere and guarantee that for the next 10,000 years. Can I just finish by saying that I've had lots of students from Wellington County Grammar and from all the local schools who've been through doing work experience at any, over recent years. If any of you are interested, very happy to do that if you want to see what it's like at the coalface.
The real world of this thing. All right then. Thank you very much. Hopefully it will work for you.